basically copy and paste your questions onto a Word document. If there's anything that's additional that I want you guys to have or to be able to read, if I feel like there's some really good material for you guys to follow up with, I'll put it in the notes. But usually the notes are just copied and paste questions. I will upload notes if that is something that I think is going to be helpful to you guys. So the first question, you can see I already have a couple links on here, and I want to kind of give you guys more updated information on this. So Marcus asked about chapter 2, and he asked about the suicide rate. Why is it so high? Why is the suicide rate, suicide so high in the leading causes of death? And then how do you prevent something like this from happening to an adolescent? And this is a really good question. Now, in the notes, I mentioned that suicide is, I believe, the third leading cause of death in adolescents behind accidents and homicide. And, you know, this is a pretty alarming thing, right? So when we look at suicide, the rates change from year to year. So I believe it was the third leading cause probably in 2015 or so. It might have bumped up to the second leading cause now. So it's worse than it was 50 years ago, but it's kind of flip-flopped. And I'm going to show you guys the rates on this so that you can see. And I believe the best rates that we have are from the CDC, which is the Centers for Disease Control. They do a lot of epidemiological studies and a lot of, so epidemiological studies are those that kind of observe trends in things like health. And so they've done a lot of really good work trying to figure out how the rates are of certain diseases, how prevalent they are, what's the prognosis, things like that. So suicide falls into that category. And I want to show you guys some of those rates. So if you see here, this is from the CDC's website. And this is one of the links that I put onto the notes that I have up. So this is from the CDC, and this report was published in 2017, August 2017. So it's about 2 years old. And this shows you the rates from males to females from 1975 to 2015. Now, if you look at this here, you'll notice that, you know, there was between the years of about 1985 to 1990, you see a pretty sharp increase there in suicide in men and boys. These are really male adolescents, male teenagers. And then you see that there's a dip here, and this dip goes from about 1995 to early 2000s. And so if you look at this, you know, this kind of dip, it's actually better than it was. So it's better than it was in the, you know, 1980s, 1990s, but you can see that it kind of goes up and down, and it's steadily rising from 2010 to 2015. There's also, you see a big difference between boys and girls, or males and females, and I'm going to get into that in just a second. So when you look at why teenagers are committing suicide. So, and this is not just teenagers, this is kind of, you know, pretty much everyone. One thing you have to look at is mental health. Our society does not treat people with mental illness or issues very kindly. We're getting better, but you know, we still have a big fight ahead of us in terms of a lot of people in society say, well, depression is situational. It's not an actual disease or a condition because we can't measure it, even though you can, and because we don't see physical effects, which you can. And so, you know, your grandmother, great grandmother might have said to you, you know, oh, if you say I'm depressed, oh, why are you depressed? You have nothing to be depressed about. You have all the good things in your life. And so we know that it's not just situational, and we know that depression and anxiety they have physiological causes in the brain. We know that it's a chemical issue. That's why medication works in so many cases. And so it's kind of an uphill battle trying to get people to realize that mental illness, even though it looks invisible and you can be okay one day and not okay the next, it's a big deal. And so we see that in a lot of cases of suicide, people are not okay, and they are kind of silently suffering. There are signs, of course, to look for, and I'm going to get into that in just a minute. And it's not necessarily just mental illness. You don't have to be depressed to commit suicide. Sometimes it is situational factors. Sometimes people feel trapped and they feel like they can't get out. This sometimes is cultural. There are other cultures that view suicide as a way to solve shame issue. Um, we also see suicide being sometimes an option for people who have been bullied. We see there's actually a very interesting study that found that in the states that legalized same-sex marriage, they've found a significant decrease in suicide in those particular states. I want to say that the rate was at least 7% decrease in suicide rates. And, so that tells us that, the LGBT community really benefits from acceptance and really benefits from having, um, in terms of legal options, viewed as, opposite sex marriage rights. And so we see that when there's more acceptance and people who are in the LGBT community, when they're being accepted and when they're not feeling isolated, we actually see that those individuals are, not going to be more likely to commit suicide. So, there's a lot of factors. It's not just sexual orientation. It's not just mental illness or mental health. There's a lot of things going on that we can address to help prevent suicide. A lot of times it is underlying issues, or the person doesn't have the resources to be able to escape their situation or to know how to make things better. So, there's definitely that issue. Now, let's talk real quick about the difference between male and female. So male and female rates differ pretty significantly, as you can see. They're something like I don't know, you see here, you can see, let's see, this is deaths per 100,000. Here we see females about 3, and then you can see males all the way up to 12. I mean, that's a huge difference in numbers. And what we find is that women tend to attempt more suicide. Men tend to be more successful. So the rates of attempting are actually not vastly different in that respect. It's just that men tend to be more successful in their suicide attempts, so they actually do end up killing themselves, whereas women might be you might not be successful and then hospitalized, obviously. And so when we look at the difference between attempt technique, we see that women tend to choose things like pills, men tend to choose things like guns. So if you're going to shoot yourself versus take pills, obviously shooting yourself tends to be a more finite and more successful way to commit suicide. And so that's why we see a lot of the difference between the two. So, that's something that's in the the literature very heavy, and people talk about a lot that's in the field about the difference between male versus female attempts and success rates. Now, I also pulled this other website. This is from the CDC as well. The reason why I pull from the CDC is, one, because it's one of the most updated ones. It's very reliable, and they're very thorough, but also it's updated. And so here you can see, now this is not suicide in just adolescents. This is suicide across ages, right? So this is in this case in the US. And so it gives you some statistics. And remember, these are statistics that are across all ages. It's not necessarily just adolescents. And so you can see here that the CDC reports that over half of the people who die by suicide actually didn't have any known mental health condition. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that, to say that they didn't have a mental health condition. It could have been undiagnosed or underlying, and we didn't know about it. But there is a significant portion of people who commit suicide without any history of mental illness or mental health conditions. So here you can actually look at the rates, excuse me, by state, and you can see the breakdown of male versus female, those who have a known mental health condition versus those who do not. And this is just a really good website to look at some of the basic general statistics. Now, what I really like is, as you move down to the end of this site, is that you can see that there's a list of 12 warning signs that you should look out for if you maybe suspect that somebody might be thinking about it, thinking about committing suicide or attempting to hurt themselves. And then on the left, you can see that there are ways to prevent it. Now, prevention techniques range from things like interventions. Most of the time when we're trying to prevent suicide, it's all about education. It's all about knowing the warning signs and then knowing what to do once you recognize that someone might be in a bad spot. And so here you can see that, this kind of scopes all across into every level of system. So we're looking at state level. How can, healthcare systems help prevent suicide? How do our communities, the employers, the schools, media, how can we help our neighbor, our family member, whatever it may be? And so there's some really good resources here for you guys to look at and take a kind of a gander at. But really it's all levels. It's not just the peer-to-peer level. It's not just, the community level. You have to address an issue like this at think of your world as an onion, and every single layer is a system, right? So at the core is you and your closest family, your direct, maybe your mom and your dad, siblings, brother, sister, and then another layer is your neighborhood or your extended family, and then your community, and it continues going out to where we look at this kind of scope of outwards to your employers, to the people that you don't even know, the media, right? So how the media addresses suicide, especially when it comes to adolescents, is extremely important. When we see the media reporting on a suicide of somebody who is if somebody is a teenager and they commit suicide and the media reports on it, we tend to see other suicides and the rate kind of increase right after that. And so we don't want to glorify it. There's a few TV shows on TV that have increased the suicide rate because it kind of glorifies suicide. I think it's 12 Reasons Why, or you guys might know know better than I can't remember. It's something X amount of reasons why. 13 Reasons Why. Thank you. Thanks for putting that in there. It actually has increased, in some cases, increased the suicide rate, but also there are some statistics that say that shows like that will decrease the suicide rate because it increases our knowledge about suicide and what we can do to help prevent it. And it also, always ends the show with like, if you know somebody and, giving the suicide hotline and all that. And so, these are things that can impact other people and other, other individuals who might be considering it. And then if you look on the right here, these are some of those warning signs that you really want to really pay attention to, because sometimes people will look on the outside, they look fine, they look like they're managing, but there's, they're trying to, they're having this sort of internal battle and they don't want anybody to know about it. So, especially like issues with sleep, if they say something about, wanting or thinking about it, take that seriously. It might be a cry for help. And some people, that's their only way of like, you think, oh, it's just for attention, but that's their only way of crying out for help. Isolating themselves, saying no when you're trying to say, hey, let's go out or let's go get lunch or whatever. And they say, no. And they keep doing that over and over again. And you get that kind of gut feeling, then you might want to ask them some questions or maybe have somebody, follow up with them and see what's going on. And I had a question here. The first page shown study, okay, was the first page shown study in the US, not the world. Are you talking about this right here, these stats? These are, I believe they're US. Yeah, okay, so these are from the United States, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so if you look at the top, it says the United States from 1975 to 2015. And so these particular statistics on the CDC are almost, they're very often United States, and they'll actually say that on there. When you look at world statistics of suicide, it gets a little bit more complicated because there are cultures that do view suicide differently. And so there are some societies that say, suicide is, it's looked down upon. And then there are other societies that actually say that it's like not a good thing, but it's something that you would do if you've shamed your family. It's an acceptable kind of solution. And there are people of all cultures in the United States, so we can't say for sure how many of those individuals kind of have that mindset, because they're from that culture, they embrace that culture. So culture does play a factor here, but these statistics specifically are yes, from the United States, not the world. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about this particular question? Did it seem to kind of get at, I know there's kind of a lot, but these things you really have to take very seriously, because you have to be careful about how we approach these sorts of things, because we have to do it very delicately, but also with a firm hand, and think about interventions and help for people who really, really need it. Because we can certainly do better. We can absolutely do better. So any questions about this particular one? Are we good? Okay, it looks like nobody's on asking about chat. So let's look. Okay, great. So let's look real quick. And this other question is probably going to be rather quick, because let's see. So this is, oh, I have it up. Okay, so Adam asked about tattoos and piercings and for other forms of body art. So he's asking, is there a connection to the choice and nature versus nurture? Are children whose parents indulge in forms of body art more likely to participate themselves? Are there influences that cause children with the opposite parenting to participate in body art for the first time in their family line? Are there contributing childhood factors that influence someone to become addicted to tattoos? So this is kind of a twofold question here. I'm going to get to the addiction part in a minute. But this is a difficult question to answer. And that's because you don't know if it's nature or nurture if you're just studying a person who is in their family and you're looking at what they do compared to their parents, because you don't know if it's genetic or you don't know if it's environmental. If a person's in that situation, you can't tease those things apart. So, if you have a person who has a parent who has a ton of tattoos, and it's just kind of instilled in them, like, okay, I can have a tattoo, it's fine. Are they going to be more likely to get a tattoo than somebody who has a parent who's like, you never, ever, ever modify your body, ever, ever? It's kind of a toss up. There are some very rebellious people, and then other people who are very religious, and they're, so I mean, it's kind of a toss up. For example, I have tattoos, my husband has tattoos, and my son, he's 7 now, he'll, put stickers on his body and fake tattoos, and he thinks it's hilarious. He thinks it's great. And it's not like I'm like, oh my goodness, let me scrub that off of you, in the bath and traumatizing him. I don't care if he, how he feels about tattoos. I have a question. Do you find that strict parenting creates rebellious children? It kind of goes either way. Honestly, we'll get into parenting later in the semester, but there's evidence going both ways. There's evidence that say that if you are very strict, and we're going to talk about the parenting type, so I'm not going to get too much into detail about that, but there are cases where you have very strict rules and strict parents, and then what ends up happening is once the child grows up and is on their own, they just go crazy. They're like, oh, I wasn't allowed to eat sugar. So then they eat a bunch of sugar, and then they like get a bunch of tattoos and piercings and, try to go all wild. So we have that case, of course. But then we also have the case where people don't do that. They grew up in a very strict environment, and they kind of internalized a lot of those rules. And so while they might not be, as strict as it was under their parents' house, they might tend to follow that same sort of pattern, because that's what they grew up with. They internalize those rules. They might have said, okay, well, this is the reason why we don't get tattoos or body modification or whatever. And I agree with that. And they keep that, and they keep that forever. So it can go either way. And I don't think necessarily, personality plays into this also really, really largely, as well as relationship with parents. If you have really strict parents and you hated it and you hated your parents, and you might be more rebellious. If you had a strict family and you were like, yeah, that's how we were, and you had a really close relationship, you might actually be a little less likely to rebel. So it just kind of depends. Now, if you want to really do a true study on this and to really see nature versus nurture, what you would do is you would take twins who were identical, and then you would, if they're adopted, you would look at how they grew up. Not knowing each other, not knowing their family, their parents, not knowing anything, and then essentially seeing who has tattoos and who doesn't. What kind of family life did the kids have? Were the parents strict? Were they against tattoos or not? And then, if regardless of how the home life was, if both twins came out full body art, and their parents had full body art, and they didn't know their parents, then we could say, hey, there might be some sort of genetic thing. Maybe it's not a genetic tendency to tattoos per se, but maybe it's a genetic tendency towards the personality traits of creativity and artistry, of seeing the body as a canvas, of liking to express themselves in a particular way. So there's a lot of dimensions here and features that there are some genetic underpinnings to some of these things, but it's really difficult to know for sure if it's what part of that is going to make them more likely to modify their body. When we look at human nature and human culture, in pretty much every culture, there's some sort of body modification and expression that humans do, right? So there are societies that use rings and they elongate the neck and they find beauty in that. There are so many societies that pierce something, whether it's their nose or their ears or their face. Body modification is not a new thing. This is something that, for hundreds of thousands of years, even millions of years, if you consider hominids and different, forms of humans, we see thousands of years ago, we see this happening because we actually have mummies and things that are adorned, so we see this kind of everywhere. So it might actually just be a human trait to want to express themselves and do body modification. So it's very difficult to know if that's a family thing or if it's a society thing. It's probably very much a combination of both, which is pretty much the answer to anything nature versus nurture. Now, addiction is a different story. You can be addicted to anything. You can be addicted to body modification. You can be addicted to tattooing. You can be addicted to alcohol, obviously, and drugs. You can be addicted to food. You can be addicted to sex. You can be addicted to eating your couch cushion. Literally, there's like an addiction for everything. Some people pull their hair out. Some people, eat their body parts. I mean, you know what I mean? Like their nails and things like that. There's so many different kinds of addictions that you can have. And addiction of itself kind of always has sort of this root issue, this root cause in the brain, where we see this reward pathway. So the reward pathway in the brain really, and this is a particular pathway that we see in any kind of addict. The fact that this reward pathway can be kind of hijacked by your addiction, whether it's food or drugs or sex or tattoos, depending on the situation. I'm talking about extreme addiction, not just, oh, when's my next tattoo? These are, extreme addiction. That is genetic. We do see some genetic and hereditary underpinnings of likelihood and risk of addiction. So that's kind of a separate thing. I wouldn't necessarily call everybody who really likes to have tattoos or has a sleeve as necessarily being addicted per se. This is just something that they like to do. And it's not like they are, working and spending every penny on tattoos. This is just a sort of a thing that they enjoy. So, that's a kind of a separate situation. And also, not being maybe necessarily not being happy with your body. That also might be something that that we can get from parents or genetic underpinnings of body dysmorphia and things like that. So that's kind of a separate issue, and we'll talk a little bit about that as time goes on. So does anybody have any questions? I think that pretty much the answer to your question is both, probably. But we can certainly do work to kind of tease those apart a little bit, but those would have to be something like twin studies or adoption studies where we actually see a difference between the parent and the child being separated. Okay, so thank you guys for tuning in. And if we don't have any questions, I'm gonna go ahead and end. And you guys should see this posted within the next day or two on Moodle. So if we're all good, you guys have a good day, and we'll see you next week.